This is the book that Howard wrote, Good Chances. And when I read this book, I was in tears of the wonderful stories. You can't imagine the stories that Howard has and the many experiences that he's had over the years since the early 70s, late 60s even, when he first went to see Swami. Um, he was one of the group known as the Sai Hippies because there were a group of young people that went there and stayed there, and they slept under a tree and slept on Swami's veranda, and they had no buildings there like we did now. They had no they swam in the well to take a bath, and so it's he's going to tell you about all those things. I won't waste his time, but last summer, I went to Feathered Pipe Ranch outside of um, Helena, Montana, where Howard lives in the summertime. He's got a cabin there on the ranch, and then he comes in the wintertime, he comes back to San Francisco. So I went up there because they had a reunion of all the Sai Hippies, and I filmed it, as you might have seen. Many of you might have seen that. So we want to welcome to our center and have a wonderful speaker tonight, Howard Levitt. Howard, you're on.
Thank you, Gene. I'm in the box that says Ralph. What is your last name, Ralph?
Borman.
Borman, because we're using Ralph's computer. So hi, everybody. My story really started right here in San Francisco. I was in the Haight-Ashbury for the Summer of Love in 1967 and lived in a commune on Clayton Street. And I had two roommates that wanted to go to India. And going to India had never really occurred to me at all, but I did want to travel. And I got a job in the post office down at Brinken Annex because that was the only place you could get a job with long hair, actually. Nobody else would hire you if you had long hair in 1967. And I saved my money. And in February 1968, I took off for Europe. And I was hitchhiking around Europe, across Europe, and wanted to go to Istanbul. And because I had studied architecture in college, and I wanted to see the Hagia Sophia and the Blue Mosque and the Topkapi Museum and all of that. And at the Greek-Turkish border, I ran into India Supra. And she basically said, well, we're all going to India. Why don't you go to India with us? And I said, oh, well, that sounds like a good idea. How do you go? And she said, you just go overland and take buses and trains. And I had met some hippies in Istanbul that were coming back from India. And so off I went to India and ended up in my traveling around. I heard of this Dr. Bindu Joshi up in Almora, who was a famous Ayurvedic doctor that some of the prominent figures from the 60s, like Allen Ginsberg and Ram Dass, had been to see. And Timothy Leary, I think, had been there. So I went up to see Dr. Bindu, and he took a liking to me. And he said to me, you know, you have to read the Bhagavad Gita. And I had never heard of the Bhagavad Gita. Maybe somebody had mentioned it to me in my travels. So I was actually the first Westerner to ever rent a village hut in Almora, because all the Westerners had always been, you know, stayed in big bungalows and nice hotels. And I had this little village hut up on the mountain with a view of the Himalayas. And it was 5 rupees a month, which was 50 cents in those days. And I was reading the Bhagavad Gita, and the chapter where Krishna says to Arjuna, in every age I incarnate, when Dharma is overrun by adharma or unrighteousness. And that chapter really stuck in my mind. I couldn't get it out of my mind for some reason. I kept saying, well, if God really exists and God can incarnate, now is definitely the time to do it, because it was the height of the Vietnam War, the height of the Cold War. You know, we were all brought up hiding under our desks with nuclear drills when I was in elementary school and high school and all that. So I felt like this was definitely a good time for God to be on the planet. So I was reading the Bhagavad Gita and starting to meditate and learn yoga. This was 1969. And I had an experience where I was sleeping in the night, and it was like raining. It was monsoon season, and it was raining very, very heavily. And I got stung by my finger by a scorpion. And I thought, oh my God, I'm going to die. You know, a scorpion bit me, and I didn't know what would happen. And it was pouring rain, and it was like 4 or 5 kilometers to the medical center in Almora, you know, and there was like no possibility in the middle of the night in the dark with no electricity and to go there. So I basically, I fell asleep and I was awakened by a voice that said, "Hey," like that. And when I opened my eyes, there was like this little figure with a dome of black hair standing by my bed. And then he just vanished. And I didn't know who it was because at that point I had never seen a picture of Swami. So I went down to Goa, ran into India again. She wanted to go on a pilgrimage to find her guru. I went with her friend Lynn, and we got into a truck. We were headed to Udupi in South India. And we saw a picture of Sai Baba. The truck driver had a picture, and he was trying to tell us he didn't speak much English. So I thought he looked like Jimi Hendrix, and I thought, well, I don't think I want to go see him, you know, because he just looks like Jimi Hendrix, and what's that all about kind of thing, you know. But after some time, you know, I came down with hepatitis. I tried to go back to America. They wouldn't let me on the plane, so I started traveling again. And eventually ran into a friend of India and Vijay's, her sister Vijay, and found out they were at Sai Baba. So I wrote a letter to India, and she wrote back to me. I was up in, I think, Manali and up in the Indian Himalayas. And she said, Sai Baba is the one we were looking for. So not knowing anything about Swami and hearing very little, I flew down to Bangalore and arrived in Whitefield, June 5th, 1970, 50 years ago. And the day I arrived, Swami left. He had a little Fiat car, an Italian Fiat. It had orange curtains in the back. And all I saw was his hand waving out the window, you know, and I was the 20th Westerner to show up, and India was there, her sister Vijay, and a couple of other people I had met in my travels were there, like Benno Weissner and Tony Milo. So Swami came back after about a week or so. He had gone to Buddha Party, and we were staying in he had a very little college in Whitefield with some classrooms, and he had given one classroom for the gents and one classroom for the ladies. And there was a veranda, and Swami came back and he walked down the veranda and he looked at me, he stopped and he said, "New man." And then he gathered us all around and he said, "Where will you all stay? The college is going to begin in a couple of days. There's no place for you to stay." And we were saying, "Oh, Swami, you know, we don't know, you know," because some of the people were living out under trees and I was staying in a little hut in Belatur village. So Swami said, "You come and stay with Swamiji in my house." So the second day that I ever saw Sai Baba in my life, I was moved into his house with 19 other young Westerners. And he gave us, he let the gents sleep on the veranda outside his bedroom on the second floor. And the ladies slept in the back of the house. You know, the ladies were Michelle Kaplowitz in India, Supra and her sister Vijay, and Victoria Mills from London, and Anne Green, who became Om. There was and a couple of others. Carrie, Janet McLuhan, she was there with her husband, Carrie. So the ladies slept in the back with Swami's mother and his sisters, and we slept on the veranda. And then there was a back stairs, and we would all gather in the early morning. And then Swami would come down the stairs, and he would greet us, and he gave us this little red book. And this little red book was about basically who is Sai Baba. And it said, "Don't try to understand me, you will only fail," you know, because kind of fish know the sky. These are some of the things I remember about reading in the book. And so he called us in for a group interview. I mean, we were staying in his house and seeing him every evening and having bhajans with him. And he was teaching us how to sing bhajans in the evening after he went out for darshan. There was a big tree at Whitefield that had like a tin shed around it, and people sat under that tree. And there was very few, his bungalow was completely different. It wasn't a lotus-shaped house like it is now. It was an old kind of Art Deco style house. And so he called us in for this first interview that I was ever in. And in it, he said that just as the devotee longs for God, God longs for a devotee. And he was pointing his fingers like this. And he said, "See, like stalactite and stalagmite in a cave." And then he said, "No, this is not good example." So he took his hand and he rotated it around, and he materialized this round black stone, which was about maybe, I don't know, a few inches in diameter, 3 inches or so. And he passed it around. It was a solid black stone. And he took it back and he held it up and he blew on it with his breath and he went, and he blew a little cave in the stone, and it had a little stalactite and a little stalagmite. And he said, see, like this. And as he passed it around, we all looked at that little cave. When it got to Gil put it in his pocket and kept it. And Gil took it to Bangalore, and he took it to this Hindu priest, and he said, well, what is this? And the Hindu priest said, this is a saligram. And a saligram is a sacred stone that's found in the rivers in the Himalayas, and it's made by a fossil. And it takes thousands of years, for this to form, because the water runs over the rock and smooths it down. And the fossil is made by this little shelled animal that's found in the rivers there. And the saligram is a sacred symbol of Shiva. And so think Swami just created a fossil with his breath. He just went and blew on it. So eventually we stayed in his house for about 2 weeks or so. And then he said, you're all going to Puta Party. And he sent us up to Puta Party in a bus that he arranged. And he sent a letter to Mr. Kasturi telling Mr. Kasturi to host us until he arrived. He said, I'm coming tomorrow. And of course, that tomorrow was about a little over a week, maybe 10 days. He finally showed up and called us in. He used to call us in for these wonderful interviews that would last 2.5 or 3 hours. And he would just send Mr. Kasturi and he'd say, tell all the farmers. And there was just 20 of us. And after the interviews were over, he would say, do you like Indian sweets? And we say, yes, Swami. He said, do you like Mysore pak or ladus? And we say, Swami, whatever you like, Swami. No, tell. And we say, okay, Swami, ladus. So he'd wave his hand like this, and he'd make ladus, and he'd go like this, and he'd pass them out to everybody in the room, and they were warm, like they just came out of the oven. And then when you looked at Swami's palm, there was no oil on his palm or anything. It was just completely clean. So sometimes he made us ladus, sometimes he made us Mysore pak. But usually about once a week or so, he would call us in for these long group interviews. And he really talked a lot about Ramakrishna Paramahamsa and Vivekananda. Those were his favorite stories. He would tell a lot of stories about the Mahabharata, about Krishna and Rama, and all the Hindu stories, but he also talked a lot about Ramakrishna Paramahamsa. And so one day he asked one of the gals what her plans were, and she said, Swami, I want to stay, but I need a visa. So he said, how many people need visas? And so our hands went up, and I said, Swami, I need a visa. And India said she needed, and then India said, well, Swami, I don't have a passport. And he goes, what? No passports? It's complete madness, And he said, how many people need passports? And I put up my hand. I said, Swami, I need to renew my passport. And he said, oh, he says, this is very bad. He said, if you don't obey the rules, the police will come and put you in jail. So he wrote a letter. In those days, there were people around him like this man named Appa, who was big in Mysore state in the government, and some other dignitaries. And he wrote a letter saying that these young people were all good and deserving cases. They had all come from so far away and given up so much to be with Swamiji and follow this spiritual path. And he wrote our names. There was like 8 names on the letter. And he sent the letter to Bangalore. But the deputy superintendent of police in Bangalore came back and said he wanted 8 individual letters. So we went back to Swami, and Swami said, everybody needs an individual letter. Well, he gave 5 letters, and 3 of us he didn't give letters to. We were 3 guys, we all were from New York City, Tony Milo, myself, and Jai Devi. And we didn't get letters. So Tony and Jai took that as a sign that they were supposed to leave and find a different teacher, and they actually left. And I felt like this was some kind of test for me, and that everybody said, well, if you go to Madras and get a new passport, then Swami will give you a letter. So went to Bangalore, waited on the train platform for the Brindavan Express, and I closed my eyes and I thought, Swami, I wish I could stay with some devotees in Madras. I really don't want to be there by myself. I don't know. It's now Chennai, of course, but then it was Madras. I don't know anybody there. And the minute I opened my eyes, this man came up to me and he said, I saw you at Whitefield in the Darshan line. He said, didn't I? And I said, yes, I was there. I said, well, are you going to Madras? And I said, yes. He said, well, why don't you come and stay with me and my family in Madras, you know, and I'll take you to Bhajan. So that was like, my prayer was instantly answered. And then he took me to this Bhajan in a suburb of Madras called Ambattur. And they said, when Swami was pleased with the bhajans, the garlands would dance back and forth in time to the music. So we started up the bhajans, and it was a very hot night. The windows were open. There was no breeze. And in India, you know, a lot of the pictures of the gurus kind of hang from the wall like this, and then they have a garland hanging down, you know, if you can just kind of get that image. And so the garlands were just still. So they said, Mr. Howard, you lead a bhajan. So I started Madhura, Madhura, Murali, Ganeshama, like that. And all of a sudden the garland started to dance in time to the music, back and forth like that. And then when I increased the tempo, the garlands increased. And when I stopped, they stopped, right? So that was a pretty amazing miracle, because Swami was in Puda Party at the time, and this was Chennai, hundreds of miles away. And the flowers were also spinning on the tops of the pictures. They had flowers tucked in, and then they would shoot off and fall in Swami's chair. They would fly across and just fall in Swami's chair. All this, so they asked me to sing another bhajan, and it all started up, and it happened again the second time, and then it stopped. So when I went back to Puda Party, Swami called us all in for an interview, and I was sitting right at his feet, right up front. Everybody pushed me up front so I could ask him for this letter, right? And he did not give me a chance at all, you know, to ask him. And we were in there for maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours. So finally at the end, we all stood up, and I finally had a chance, and I said, Swami, I need a letter for my visa. And he came over to me and he said, yes, I'm giving. I've already told Kasturi. And I started to cry. So I was so relieved, you know. So he came up and he rubbed my chest like that. And he said, don't worry, I'm always with you. So that was the first, well, of course, seeing him materialize holy ash and soligrams and rings and lockets and necklaces and all that was pretty miraculous. But seeing the garlands dance in time to the music hundreds of miles away, that was pretty amazing too. I ended up staying all the way through 70 and 71 till Christmas 71. But around Christmas time in 1970, we heard a rumor that Swami was going to Goa. And we wanted, of course, to go. But Mr. Kasturi came out, and at that time we weren't staying in Swami's house in 71. We were outside, but we had garden privileges. So we could go in the gate and we could sit in the garden and meditate and see Swami come out. And he would come out in the garden and talk to us and joke with us. And I mean, it was just so much access. It was amazing. And so we heard he was going to Bombay, Goa, and then Bombay. And we wanted to go. So Kasturi came in the garden. He said, no, don't go. He said, it's going to be a very busy trip for Swami, and so we didn't listen. And we, about 5 of us or 6 of us, no, it was 7 of us, right? We were the 7 rockets. We got on the bus, and 30 hours we went to Goa. You know, in those days, I was in my 20s, 30 hours on an Indian bus didn't mean anything. And when we got to Goa, we got permission from Governor. He was staying at the governor's mansion, which was this beautiful mansion on a peninsula overlooking the Arabian Sea that had been built by the Portuguese colonists, you know, for their governor or whatever. And so this was a beautiful place Swami was staying in. When we got to the mansion, we were allowed in. We got to the gate. They called in. Swami said, yes, we could come in. Swami had an appendicitis thing and canceled his talk. And but we were still allowed in. And within the next day, he was up and around after this appendicitis. And there was one step where we were waiting. It was like a big veranda that overlooked the Arabian Sea. And there was one step up for Swami to go into this big grand dining hall. And he would stop and talk to us and when he stepped up the step, he was very careful, and he went down the step because his side was still hurting him a little. And then he told us to come to Bombay with him, with now Mumbai, of course. So we went to Bombay, to the Dharma Kshetra, and he gave us some rooms there. And also we had the regular darshan with the public, but then we were allowed up into Swami's house where we attended music concerts. And that's when he said, he came out one evening after a music concert. We were waiting right outside the lotus-shaped house at Dharma Kshetra, and he was going over to the guest house where Dr. Hislop and Indra Devi were staying, and some other people. And he said, that's when he said to us, this is good chance for you. Because he said, in the future, there'll be many, many people trying to see Swamiji. So that's why I titled my book, Good Chances, from what Swami said. And then after Bombay, we went back to Puttaparthi, and I stayed all through 1971. I got a letter from the Indian government saying my visa was expired and I'd have to leave the country to renew my visa. So I went to Swami. In those days we could just say Swami, Swami, and he would stop and listen on the darshan line. And we had the front 2 rows saved for us in the mandir for the foreigners. And in those days for bhajan, on the men's side it was about half full, and on the ladies' side about 3/4 full for bhajans. That's how few people were there, and there was no ornamentation. You've seen pictures of how it looked. It was just like a square mandir, and it was painted green and white. There was no fancy sculpture or anything like that. And so Swami said to me, he said, go to Ceylon. It hadn't been changed back to Sri Lanka yet. He said, go to Ceylon. He said, you tell your experiences. I'll have Mr. Kasturi write a letter to the president of the Sai Samiti. They called them Seva Samitis in those days. So, and then Swami said, my car is going to Bangalore for repair. You can go in my car to Bangalore. So I was on the veranda, but which wasn't a big deal in those days because everybody was allowed on the veranda. There were so few people. And I was waiting for the driver. And then suddenly somebody came downstairs from Swami's room and he handed me a big package of vibhuti. Swami wants you to have this vibhuti. So I go in Swami's car with the driver. I'm sitting in the back seat of Swami's car and going to Bangalore, and I had nothing else to do. So I counted the packets of vibhuti, and there was like 50 packets of vibhuti. So I get down to Tiruvannamalai, not Tiruvannamalai, I'm sorry, that's the place where you catch the ferry to Sri Lanka. I forget the name of it. It's down in South India. And they said to me, you need a cholera shot to get into Sri Lanka, to Ceylon. And I said, well, I don't have a cholera shot. So the guy at the customs desk, he said, well, you have to get a cholera shot, and then there's a 10-day quarantine before we can let you go to Sri Lanka. And I said, oh my God, what should I do for 10 days? And he said, well, why don't you go take the train overnight and go to Madurai and see the Meenakshi temple. It's a beautiful temple, and you can spend your 10 days like that and get your vaccine there and enjoy South India and then come back, and then you can go to Sri Lanka. So I said, fine, what else could you do? So I got on the train overnight and I go to Madurai, where the famous Meenakshi temple is. And I get to the train station. It's about 6 in the morning, and there's somebody sleeping on the counter that says information desk, right? So I got my little backpack, my 50 packets of vibhuti in a plastic sack, and my sleeping bag. And so I asked him, where can I get an injection, a cholera shot? So he said, oh yes, cholera shot, cholera shot. So he drew me a map, right? So I follow this map, and it leads me to the Sri Satya Sai nursing home. So I said, oh, okay, this is where you get your cholera shot. Great. So I ring the doorbell, and nurse opens the door, and she said, I said, I've come from Puttaparthi, and I need a cholera shot. And she says, oh, no, we don't do cholera shots here. She said, that's way over on the other side. But she said, let me get the doctor because he'll be so happy to see somebody from Puttaparthi. So I said, great. So the doctor comes down, it's early in the morning. He's tying his lungi and everything, and we sit in his office. And he said, 3 days back, I wrote Swami a letter asking him for 50 packets of vibhuti. And I'm waiting for that vibhuti to arrive. And I said, well, I have 50 packets of vibhuti. And obviously it's meant for you, because I was totally sent to the wrong place. It was all just, it looked like it was all just a coincidence, but we know it wasn't a coincidence. So I gave him those 50 packets of vibhuti and stayed in Madurai. He was very nice. He hosted me, sent me around. So finally my 10 days were up. I went to Sri Lanka. And I was in Sri Lanka and gave talks. I went all over the island. It was quite beautiful. And then the Indo-Pakistan War broke out in 1971. And they said they wouldn't be able to give me a visa to go back to India because of the war. They weren't issuing visas. So I'd have to go back to America. So I called my father in New York. And in those days, to make a call, it took hours. You had to book a trunk call and wait and everything. So I got a ticket on Swiss Air through Mumbai and then on to New York. And when I got to the airport in Mumbai, I had to go through customs, and the guy said to me, the customs official, he said, do you want to have a 3-week landing permit? They had a thing, like if you arrived at the airport, they would give you a 3-week visa. They called it like a landing permit. And I said, I thought you weren't issuing any visas. He said, oh, no, we can give 3 weeks to you. No problem. So I immediately went to Swiss Air, changed my ticket for 3 weeks later. Those days you could change your ticket without any fee. It was free to change your ticket. So immediately called a flight to Bangalore, went to Darshan. Swami comes up to me in Darshan and he says, come to Madras. We're all going to Madras. So we get back on the Brindavan Express down to Madras, and we're having incredible darshan with Swami. There was a house that he used to stay at where they had cemented their whole front lawn and put up one of those colorful pandals or tents. And we were there. So one morning, Swami came out very early. We were there because usually there was a very early darshan, like 6 in the morning. And then there'd be Nagas and Kirtan. And so Swami came out and he walked right up to me and he said, I'm going to the hospital to see Walter Cowan. Walter Cowan died in the hospital and I'm going to see him. You wait here, I'll be back in 1 hour. So 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, no Swami. So Michelle found out that Swami had gone from the hospital to visit the widow of the former chief minister of Madras, Tamil, whatever the state was. I can't remember. Is it Madras state? But anyway, so we didn't know. Tamil Nadu. Yeah, okay, Tamil Nadu. So Michelle remembered that where this lady, she had been visiting the year before, and she remembered that it was a very swank neighborhood. So we got into this taxi and we were zooming around this very fancy neighborhood Michelle knew, but she didn't know where the house was. And I closed my eyes and I prayed to Swami. I said, please give me a talisman, because by this time it was Christmas Day, 1971, and my ticket was for that evening at 6 o'clock to fly back from Madras to to Bombay, and then Bombay on to New York. And so I closed my eyes and I prayed for Swami to give me a talisman. So finally we see this house with this tent, this pandal, colorful tent. And we said, that must be it. So we get there and of course, Swami's there. And so we get out of the cab, we're standing in the pandal with other devotees, and Swami comes out of the house, walks right up to me and he said, I'm going to the hospital to see Walter Cowan. I'll be back in an hour. The same thing he had said early in the morning. So this time he did come back in an hour and he called us into a private room for an interview. There was myself, India, Leela, a couple from Hawaii, Steve and Irene, Al, who were just wonderful people, and a couple of other people. And in the course of the interview, he looked at me and he said, you have dirty thoughts and doubts. And I said, what should I do about that, Swami? He said, don't worry, he's passing clouds. And he rotated his palm and he made this little coin, which I still have around my neck from 1971. You probably can't see it from here, and he walked up to me and he said, here, keep this with you in America. And he just put it in my pocket. And on one side it says, it has Shirdi Sai with a little TPS under Shirdi. And on the other side, it has a hand, the abaya, and it says, why fear when I am here? So it was exactly what I had closed my eyes and asked him for in the taxi. So another way that Swami demonstrated his omniscience. And then I went back to New York and stayed in New York for 3 months and wanted to come back. I had a return ticket. In those days, tickets were like $500, $450, $550, depending on where you bought them from, round trip, which was a considerable amount of money in the 70s. And so I came back. Swami was in New Delhi. I got a last minute call that Swami was in New Delhi. So I changed my ticket. And like I said, in those days, oh, well, originally I was flying to Bombay. You can change your ticket to Delhi. There was no extra charge, you know. So I flew to Delhi, and Swami was at Sohan Lal's house. And there were like 50,000 people outside. And the police were there, and the military, and the crowds were pushing and shoving, and it was total pandemonium, like it can get in India. And Swami, but all the foreigners were inside the compound of Sohan Lal's house. There was a big wall. And so the volunteers who were outside kind of pushed me towards the gate. They opened the gate a little bit, and when they opened the gate, there was a huge swell of pushing, and you kind of got pushed in and thrown on the floor. And there I was inside the compound. And so we were allowed to be in the compound, and then Swami would go out. He would walk and give us all darshan. And he would go out into the crowd, thousands and thousands of people. It was really insane. And so there was another Westerner there, and they were singing this Narayana bhajan. And the Westerner, he was, I think his name was Paul. He was asking me, what's that word? What's that word they're singing? And I said, it's Narayana. I kept saying, Narayana, Narayana, like that, trying to pronounce it. And he said, what does it mean? And I said, I think it means God in human form. So Swami was way, way out in the crowd. So after about 15 minutes, Swami came back in. He came in the gate. He walked up to me. He stopped him and he looked at me and he goes like this. He goes, Narayana, Narayana. And he laughed and then he just walked on. And another way that he shows you that he knows your thoughts and what you're thinking and everything. And so after that, we went back to Whitefield, and Swami held the first summer course in 1972, Indian culture and spirituality. And he invited the Western gals, but none of the gents except me and this British guy named Jonathan. We were the only two Westerners he invited to this summer course. And that summer course was incredible. Every day there were discourses by Swami and so much darshan, Swami walking around. And there was about 300 or 400 or 500 students from all over India, from the top universities who were invited for this. And he had the top professors and scholars. And 1972, that's when I met Dr. Sandwise, showed up in the middle of that summer course. And that was an amazing time. And one time, Jonathan, there was a tent set up in the back with like desks and chairs, like student kind of desks. And Jonathan and I were sitting there early one day, and nobody else was in the pandal. And Swami came out of his house because the pandal was attached to his house. And he came between the rows, and he was standing there right in front of Jonathan and I, and he was talking to us. And Jonathan was telling him about, Swami, I have difficulty meditating. And in the course of everything, Swami said that, he said, this life is a dream. He said, this is daydream. He said, at night you go to sleep and have night dream. And he said, this is daydream. And it was just amazing that he was just sort of standing right in front of us and giving us a chance to ask him anything we wanted to ask him. And then, so after the summer course was over, we went, we were in Whitefield. We went back to, no, we were still in Whitefield, and I needed a letter from my visa again, because I had been there like by now 3 months, and I wanted to get another month and another 3 months or another year. I forget why I needed a letter, but they wanted me to get a letter. So I kept asking Swami, trying to ask him, but he wouldn't give me a chance to ask him. And I had a place in his garden, which was my special place, you know. So finally one day Swami said, wait in your place, he said to me, and I'll come. So I came out, and he came out of the bungalow, and I said, Swami, they want me to have another letter from my visa to stay. He says, I don't give letters. He said, Mr. Kasturi gives the letters. You go to see Mr. Kasturi and tell him. So, you just did whatever Swami said. So I got on the bus, 8 hours, the SRS bus to Puta Party, saw Mr. Kasturi. Mr. Kasturi said, well, I didn't hear anything from Swami. Swami hadn't gotten in touch with him to tell him to give me letters. But Mr. Kasturi said, I'll give you this letter, and you'll take it to Swami, put it in an envelope, take it to Swami and see if he approves it. You give it to him. And if he approves it, you can use it. If not, then there's nothing you can do. So I go back to Whitefield, and they're having an anniversary of the Joy Ice Cream Factory, and all the foreigners were invited. So I went down to the Joy Ice Cream Factory, and I somehow ended up in the front row, and Swami was sitting on a platform in this chair, and he made a sign like this, like, did you get the letter? And I nodded, and he made a sign with his hand like that. Then he went back to the house, to Whitefield, and apparently he was very upset. And he said, how can Mr. Kasturi give that man a letter without my telling him to do so? Hasn't he learned anything, So I found out Swami was really mad at Kasturi for giving the letter, and I didn't know what to do. So we went back to Puta Party, and they were constructing the canteen, and they were constructing the Purnatendra, and I don't know what came over me, but I had to find out if Swami approved of this letter, and I knew he was going to inspect the canteen, so I hid behind the door a couple of hours early down there. And when Swami came in the canteen, and there was nobody else there, and it was just under construction, it wasn't finished, I jumped out from behind the door, and I opened this letter, and I said, Swami, I need this letter. I need you to approve this letter. He said, where did you get this? And I said, from Mr. Kasturi. He says, no. He said, this is not good. So that night, Mr. Kasturi came to the shed. We were all staying in the shed because there were no rooms. Everything was under construction. It was 1972. And where's that letter? Swami said, you made forgeries of the letter, and you were going to give it out to all the foreigners. So I had to give up the letter, and I was very, very disappointed. And but for some reason, the government of India gave me an extension, even without the letter, after all that running around. And Swami was mad at me. He was just really mad at me. He wouldn't talk to me after that. So I stayed for some months, and then finally went back, and came back in 1972. I had met Dick Bach, who started the Hollywood Center back in 70. And Dick said, come to LA, because he was starting a new business, and I said I would help him. So I was staying at the Hollywood Sai Center, which was on Sunset Boulevard in those days, in an old Tudor house. It probably doesn't even exist anymore. This is 1972. And working with Dick Bach. And Dick was such an amazing person. He was the founder of Pacific Jazz Records and recorded all the great jazz artists in the 50s and 60s, and introduced Ravi Shankar to George Harrison, and turned them all on to Swami and everything like that. And so Dick was a great friend and a great mentor. And 73, I went back to see Swami. He just ignored me the whole time. And 74, I came back. He came up to me and he said, go back to America. No work. You're lazy. Go back and do work. But I had just gotten there, so I stayed for some months, and he just ignored me the whole time. But then, so then I went back and started to work in New York in the interior design field, because I had gone to architecture school, and I met a Sai devotee just by chance at one of Hilda Charlton's meetings, who owned an interior design firm. And he said, come work for me. It was just that simple. I didn't have to submit a resume or go through any process. And so I worked for Harry Patterson. And then in 77, Michelle and Vijay were going back to ask Swami if they could marry. Vijay had met someone, Michelle had met someone who was a Sai devotee. So we all went, and in 1977, he was very friendly to me when I got there. He was like, I hadn't been there in 3 years, and Swami seemed very glad to see me. He immediately came up and he said, how many people in your group, And I said, Swami, I forget, maybe it was 10 or 12 or 13 or something like that. So he called us in for interview. And in the course of one of the interviews he gave me, he said, next year, come back for summer course. I'm having a summer course. That was 1978. So went back to New York, was working for Harry Patterson, was very, I had a lot of allergies in New York and I wasn't feeling good. And I really wanted to move to California where the weather was milder. I didn't like the snow. I didn't like the ice. So 78, came back for the summer course. And after the summer course, I really, really wanted an interview with Swami to ask him what, if I could move to California, you know. So I finally got the interview, and Swami said to me, what about your work, sir? And I said, Swami, I want to move to California. I don't like, and he said, why move? He said, native place is best. I said, but Swami, my health is very bad in that cold, damp climate I want to be in. Not that San Francisco was much better, but he said, I want to be in a better climate. And he said, well, what do you really want to do? And I said, well, what I really want to do, it just came out. I said, Swami, I want to stay here and work for you. And he took my hands, he had both my hands. He said, yes, yes. He said, I'm building a planetarium. He said, you go back and get planetarium training and come back and work in the planetarium. So I said, planetarium training? I said, I had no background whatsoever in science or astronomy or anything like that. So, but Swami said, you know, Swami said, get planetarium training. You have to get planetarium training somehow. So I went back to New York. And my late friend, John Gilbert, who was a devotee who passed away in the 70s of cancer, he said, he found out, and there was no internet in those days, mind you, but he found out there was an international planetarium conference being held in Washington, D.C. So we went down, and all these different universities had booths set up with their planetarium courses. And Swami had said to me when he was holding both my hands, he said, the last thing he said, there's a planetarium in California. So San Francisco State was the only school that would allow you to take a planetarium training course without a Bachelor of Science degree. So I met this woman there who was teaching physics and astronomy, and she was hosting the booth. And she said, you can come and audit the course. I told her what was going on and everything, and she thought it was fantastic. So I came out to San Francisco in January 1979 to take planetarium training at San Francisco State University. Completed the course, went back to India, did a whole year of planetarium training, went down to Spitz Laboratories in Chatsford, Pennsylvania to learn how to use a Spitz 512 planetarium system, sent Swami literature on it through Goldstein and everything. So I come back in 1979 and expected, you know, Swami to take me in and all this planetarium being built. And I found out the planetarium project's been shelved. And Swami's just ignoring me, you know, I mean, just not giving me any chance. Usually in darshan, I could go like this and Swami, and he would stop and listen to what I said. And so he's ignoring me. So finally, he let me stew for about 10 weeks. I think it was 10 or 11 weeks. I was just sitting there thinking, well, now what? You know, I gave up everything, left my job, gave up my little cottage, and I was living in Westchester up in Pound Ridge, New York, and came to do this planetarium, and there's no planetarium. So one day he walked up to me in the darshan line in Puja Party, and he said, there's no planetarium. What can I do? Go back to any work there. And he walked away. So I just broke out crying, you know, and everybody came up to me after darshan and said, what did Swami say to you? Why are you crying? What did he say? You know, and so that evening in the bhajan, Swami is sitting in his chair, he's writing and he's looking at me and he's going like this and, you know, looking very compassionate, and I'm just tears streaming down my face and I'm just totally dejected and devastated. So the next morning, he comes out and he walks around the circle where that lotus used to be. This is all before Sai Kowan Hall and all the fabulous stuff. He walks around the circle and he says, I will see you tomorrow. And then he just goes back in. So that was the entire morning darshan. He just walked around the circle, stopped at me, and he said, I will see you tomorrow. So next morning, I go up to the veranda, calls me in with a bunch of people, and he sits in his chair and he says, see, there's no planetarium. What can I do? And they had actually ordered a small miniature planetarium for the college at Whitefield to kind of psych the students up about the big planetarium that was coming. And he said, see, he said, I wanted a big, he's so childlike, Swami, and so sweet. He says, see, I wanted a big planetarium. He said, but they sent me a small one. It's all made of plastic. Everything in America is made of plastic. He said, what can I do? And he blamed it all on Goldstein and Bhagavan, and he said it was all their fault. And he said, go back to America. And he said to me, do engineering and construction. So I thought, what? You know, engineering and construction, I have like no background in engineering. I was doing interior design, you know, interior decorating and stuff for very high end through Harry Patterson. And I had no background in engineering and construction. I didn't know what he was talking about. So I go back to San Francisco and I go to a headhunter, they called them in those days, and said, I have a background in interior design. So she puts together a nice resume for me. You know, I had some stuff from New York and portfolio, dressed me up nice, you know, told me to go get a nice suit and tie. I think I was wearing like Birkenstocks and a corduroy jacket because I thought, you know, it's California, you know. So, and I ended up getting hired as an interior designer for Bechtel Corporation. And I didn't even know what they were, but it turned out they were the largest engineering and construction company in the entire world. So Swami had said in Buddha Party, do engineering and construction. And I get hired by this company that's the biggest engineering construction company. And he had said, work 5 years. He said, next come back, I'll have some work for you here. So that's what he said. So I worked 5 years at Bechtel. And one morning I woke up and I felt this weird sensation in my kundalini, like my kundalini was like activating. It was a very weird sensation. And I felt like the karma for this job was over. It was just ended. And when I went to the office, they had completely, it was kind of a recession. It was what year was this already? 1984, I think it was, 85, no, 84. And they had run out of work for me. So I sat there and there was no work. So I finally said, okay, something's going on here. Swami had said, work 5 years, next come back. So I decided to go back to India. So my boss asked me to wait until the end of the year because he was going trekking in Nepal and wanted me to just be there just in case anything came up. So it turned out that I worked there exactly 5 years to the day. So I come back to, I decided I'm going to move out of my house, sell everything I own, go back to India and see what's next. So I'm sitting in my house on empty crates, you know, and Michelle Kaplowitz called me from LA and she said, are you sitting down? And I said, well, I don't have any furniture, but sitting on a crate. And she said, Swami's building the planetarium. And I said, I thought I was going to go back to India peacefully and not be having to mind trip about anything. And now Swami's building the planetarium. And she said, you should call Goldstein. Called Dr. Goldstein. He said, yeah, it's true. The planetarium's going to happen. So I said, well, I'm going to be in India for Christmas and then for 3 months in the winter. So I'm there in India. Goldstein is there. And one day Swami came up to me in Darshan and I said, Swami, he said to me, did you have planetarium training? And I said, yes, Swami, I did. He said, yes, I will see. So apparently he went in the car with Goldstein and they talked about it. And he said to Goldstein that I could come and work in the planetarium and we'll see if I can adjust, you know, because I had been in San Francisco for 5 years and I had been doing very well, had a beautiful house and living quite a nice life at the time. And so Swami said, let's see if he can adjust. So I decided I wasn't going to wait around for the planetarium to be constructed. I would come back when it's ready, right? So I went back to New York to see my parents and ended up through a connection getting a job in this architecture firm in Manhattan. And it was a temporary job. It lasted for about 3 or 4 months. And then I decided to go out to Montana and see India at the Feather Pipe Ranch and was spending time there and helping out at the ranch. And I get a phone call from Dr. Goldstein. And it was like August of 1985. And he said, can you be in India by November 1st? Because they want to open the planetarium for Swami's birthday. And I hadn't done anything with planetariums for 5 years. I went back to interior design and was, working in San Francisco for the Bechtels, and they had 7 homes. They were billionaires even in those days. And their corporate suites and executive suites and doing all that. And so I had to go back to Chadsford, Pennsylvania to Spitz Laboratories because Swami ended up they ordered a Spitz 512 planetarium. There are 3 companies at that time that made 3 or 4 in the world. One was Spitz in Pennsylvania, one was Zeiss in Germany, Minolta in Japan, like that. So there weren't that many places. So Swami went with the Spitz 512 planetarium. So I went back to Chadsford, Pennsylvania, and my dearest friends, Robbie and Suzanne, Levin and Philly, Robbie drove me down there every single day. Got a refresher course for about a month. Flew to India, and there's the planetarium under construction, and so I'm in the planetarium, and Swami comes up the stairs, and he looks at me like, just like I'm supposed to be there. He doesn't say anything. And we got it ready enough, even though there was more work to be done. There was still some gaps where we hung black velvet cloth, and we got it ready enough for the opening of the planetarium. And that was at the World Conference in 1985, and there was maybe hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people there in the stadium. And then for the opening of the planetarium, Swami came up to the console, and there was this big console. And if I looked at it today, I would have no idea what to do. It's probably just a laptop today, but and I programmed the show so that the music from 2001 Space Odyssey would come on, and the star projector would slowly rise up. So Swami is standing there at the console next to me, and I said, Swami, will you like to start the planetarium? And I showed him the button. So he pushed the button down, and I said, no, Swami, you have to push the button up. He goes, oh. And so he's holding the button up, and the star projector starts to rise. And I said, Swami, do you see the star projector? And Swami said, no, I can't see. I'm very short. So finally, the star projector came up, and Swami sat down, and we had this planetarium show. And then he let me hold his hand and walk him down the aisle and out to his car, holding his hand the whole time. And outside, there was just like hundreds of thousands of people. It was a huge thing. And so that was it. And then the planetarium shut down. And so we kind of sat around waiting for the construction to be finished. And in India, they take a little bit longer time than they do in America to do things. And so weeks went by, and weeks turned into months. And Swami would come down and visit at the planetarium. And one time he came down and nobody else was there. The rest of the crew was gone, and I was alone. And Swami pulled up in his car, and he came out. So he wanted me to walk him around and show him everything. So we're walking around the planetarium, and I'm showing him this, and he's looking at that. And he said to me, he turned to me and he said, in the future, he said, many, many, many people will come to see Swamiji, he said. So this has to be nice, And so in March, everybody went to Whitefield after Shivaratri. And I call that the month of miracles, because Swami just did so. I was on the driveway with the students, other people who were there, like Howard Murphy was there, Maynard Ferguson, the famous jazz musician who passed away, was there. Howard Murphy was there, and Swami was just, one day he was out on the Darshan line, and a student wanted Swami to sign a picture. So he gave Swami the picture and the pen ran out of ink. So Swami gave him back the pen, stepped back, waved his hand like this, and produced this beautiful red and gold pen, and took the top off, signed the picture, and gave the red and gold pen to the boy. And I was very friendly with Mr. Ratnlal, who I had met in 1970, and we remained good friends. And Mr. Ratnalal was the first to publish Swami's books, and he was a very wealthy man from Mumbai. His brother was Sohan Lal. And I would visit Mr. Ratnalal. He had a bungalow behind Swami's in the compound, and Mrs. Ratnalal would bring Swami his food. Then we would get the leftovers from Swami's plate. But Mr. Ratnalal were both of us we liked to read Sri Ramana Maharshi because Swami had told us to read Ramana Maharshi. And so we were always discussing, the self-inquiry path and the Vedantic philosophy. So one day, Mr. Ratnalal and I were standing on the driveway waiting for Swami to come out. Of Trey Vrindavan had been built by this time. And Swami, there was some planters by the doors, the main doors, and ice plant was growing. And in California, we have ice plant grows along the coast. It looks like little teeny green bananas, in a cluster. So he picked off one of the little green bananas and he came up to Mr. Ratnalal and me. We were just standing there. He had it between his fingers and he said to Mr. Ratnalal, "What is this, sir?" Mr. Ratnalal said, "Swami, I don't know the botanical name." And Swami said, no, this is God. And he went, he blew on it with his breath and it turned into a black oval lingam made of stone instantaneously. So he gave it to Mr. Ratnalal, but then he saw Mr. Ratnalal had a chain around his neck. So Swami took the chain out like this and he said, oh, give it back, give it back. So he took back the lingam and he held it the long way and he blew a hole with his breath. He went like that, blew a hole down the stone so that Mr. Ratnalal could wear it around his neck. So there you have Swami changing a plant into a stone and then blowing a hole down the center of the stone so Mr. Ratnalal could wear it on his neck. Through the course of all the years that I was with Swami from 1970 to 1986, which was the last time I was there and left. And then they blacklisted me, the government of India blacklisted me for working in the planetarium. And I was never allowed to go back and stopped trying after some years. He just, I saw him materialize through so many different things. At Michelle and BJ's double wedding, he made the earrings for the ladies. And as he was rotating his palms, you could hear these little bells jingling. And then suddenly he closed his hand and when he opened it, 2 sets of earrings with little tiny bells. And one set was green and gold. I think he gave those to Vijay, and one was red and gold. And he gave those to Michelle. And and I've seen him make the sacred thread. I was in a thread ceremony once in an interview with this Indian family, and the Upanayanam, they call it in India, where they invest you with a sacred thread. It's kind of like a Hindu bar mitzvah. And Swami materialized the thread and he pulled it out of his hand and he put it around the boy's neck and he did these prayers. And he would materialize, I've seen him do many rings where he would take a cheap ring off of somebody's finger and say, now I'm going to make you a valuable ring. And he would just blow on it and change it completely into a diamond ring or a gold ring or something like that. I mean, he just had this ability to transform matter completely. And then in the last, yes.
Let me ask you, we've got about 10 minutes. So,
Okay,
and I
sure.
know that, are you telling me that you haven't been back since 86?
No, I haven't been back since 86.
Wow.
But I've had many dreams and many experiences. And what happened in 1980 was the last 10 minutes. The woman I met in Washington, D.C., who hosted the San Francisco State planetarium show, when I went out there to study the planetarium training, she and I became involved in this affair. And she was an astrophysicist, and I thought I was supposed to marry her. And she was invited to go to China to teach at Beijing University. So I asked her if she would stop and see Swami and ask Swami if we're supposed to be married. So she went to Puja Party and she gave Swami a letter. Swami took the letter, read it, and just threw it back to her and walked away. So she felt that Swami definitely didn't want us to be married. And then she went off to China. And I waited for her for about 8 months. And then finally she came back and she said, no, she told me what happened, and she said, I definitely don't think Sai Baba wants me to marry you. And I'm going to go get my doctorate in astrophysics in Berkeley. So I was so mad at Swami. I was so devastated. I was lying in my room. I was living upstairs at the San Francisco Center in Hayes Valley. And I was so mad at Swami that I looked at his picture. I was lying in bed and I got up and I took my flip-flop and I just threw it at his picture and said, I hate you, Swami, and I never want to see you again. So then I'm lying there in bed and there are lights, the street light is coming through. I had like bamboo shades over the window, so the street light is filtering through. And I heard these two cherry bombs. It sounded like cherry bombs go off inside my head. There was no pain. It was like two loud bangs. And then suddenly I looked up and there, out of a blaze of light, Swami appeared from the waist up, out of this blaze of light. And he was floating over my bed and he reached down and I reached up and we held hands and I said, Swami, is that you? And he said, yes, yes. He said, don't worry, I'm always with you. And and then he vanished into a blaze of light. And it was such an amazing experience. And then 6 years later in 1986, I had 3 interviews before I left. And in one interview, he leaned over in his chair and he said to me, 6 years back, there was that girl you wanted to marry. Confirming the experience. And, so when I came back from Puda Party in 86, I went back to Feather Pipe Ranch and ended up becoming the manager and staying there over 20 years. And we developed international yoga vacations. And every time I went abroad, Swami would come in my dream. And then for many, many years, very significant dreams. And recently in 2014, I was diagnosed with CLL, which is chronic lymphocytic leukemia, which is fortunately treatable. And I'm on a pill I take every day. And Swami, when I was diagnosed with that, Swami came in my dream and he held my hand. And then it was a slow developing kind of leukemia, so they don't start you on the medication till it gets to a certain level. And when it got to a certain level and they were starting me on the medication, I knew cancer drugs were very, very, very expensive. And I didn't know what I was going to do. And then one night, Swami came to my dream, and it was a very quick dream. And just said, think of Swamiji. And this was 2017. So the next morning, I get a phone call, and it's the pharmacy saying, your medicine is ready. So I said, well, before you send it, how much is this going to cost? And they said $1,000 a month after Medicare, after my copay with Humana and everything, $1,000 a month. So I said, well, I can't afford that. It's too much. So she said to me, well, would you like to apply for a grant? And I said, how do I do that? She said, well, I'll call you back in 1 hour. You do it on the phone. They called me back in an hour. I answered some questions and they approved my grant. And every single year I get reapproved with a phone call. And it's been that simple. And Swami had come to me the night before in the dream and he said, think of Swamiji. So the medicine they gave me the first year wasn't working very well. And my white blood cell count was still very high. I was invited to Australia to speak on Swami 2017. And even with a high white blood cell count, I went there and I was very weak. I couldn't walk up hills or anything, but they took wonderful care of me in Australia. They were amazing. And but the medicine still was not working the way it should be. So Sharma, who hosted me down in Sydney, went to Puda Party and he sent me fresh vibhuti. So January 2018, he sent me that vibhuti. And when I started to take the vibhuti, within a week or so, my white blood cells came way, way down and the medicine started to work. And since then, I've been fine pretty much. I mean, there have been some side effects, but not too bad. So I take vibhuti every day with my medication and chant the vibhuti song. And that's just another one of Swami's miraculous things that he's done for me in my life. So it's been a great blessing.
Howard, we're so grateful to have you here tonight.
Thank you.
It's a real treat to hear these stories. And you will certainly be in our hearts and minds forever.
Thank you.
And you'll be on the internet forever.
Oh, God.
And we're very, very grateful for your
Thank
coming
you.
tonight.
Thank you.
Now, if you want to go to bed and want to
No,
close, it's
if
okay.
people have some questions they want to ask me or anything.
Okay. Do we have any questions? Anybody want to ask Howard a question? I think we're all full. We're
Good,
full.
good.
Now, if you want to, we have another 15 minutes or so of prayers. So if you want to go and rest, because I know you're up past your bedtime, and if you want to close, we can go ahead and do our prayers and say goodnight to you, or you can stay with us, either one. So no worry. And we want to especially want to thank Ralph Borman,
Yeah,
who
Ralph.
is with Ralph. Can you come and get in the picture? Let everybody see you for a second. This is
There he
Ralph.
is.
This is Ralph Borman. Ralph actually went
Showing your face.
yesterday to make sure this broadcast would work, and went to Howard's apartment, and we checked the internet system and everything to make sure we would be able to have a talk tonight. Thank you very much, Ralph, for coming, and Howard, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And I'm going to turn it over to Daniela, who's going to do our closing prayers. And if you need to go, there's no problem at all. Okay.
Okay, thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
Howard. God bless you. Sai Ram.
Sorry.
Okay.